The Blue Ridge Mountains cradled Sarah Howe Tim's small cabin in an embrace of ancient timber and swirling mist. For years her lens had sought the hidden lives within these slopes, capturing moments of wild grace. Oh, a deer stepping delicately through ferns, a hawk riding the thermals, the fleeting shadow of a bear. But one creature, elusive and enigmatic, held a particular fascination: the bobcat. This story unfolds in that mystical space where human empathy meets untamed instinct, a narrative tapestry woven with threads of awe, desperation, responsibility, and an unexpected heart-stopping bond. Itaudam's a journey into the quiet wildness of the mountains and the echoing wildness within the human heart, exploring the profound lengths one woman would go to answer a silent plea carried on a storm wind, forever changing her life and forging a connection that defied the natural order, reminding us that compassion knows no species boundary. If you enjoy this story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Sarah first saw her not as a distinct individual, but as a fleeting whisper of tawny fur against the autumn palette. A flicker at the edge of the woods, a ghost slipping between the poplars and oaks that crowded the slope behind her home. Sarah, a wildlife photographer whose patience was measured in seasons rather than hours, felt the familiar thrill, the electric current that signaled the presence of something truly wild. She, TMD, spent years documenting the rhythms of the Blue Ridge, learning the subtle language of the forest. The snap of a twig, the alarm call of a jay, the scent of damp earth and pine. Seeing a bobcat near her dwelling, however, was a rarity, a gift. She named her Shadow Tiem in her mind, a silent acknowledgement of the Tiem's ephemeral nature. Through the long lens of her camera, Sarah began to piece together the bobcat Tiem as territory, observing her cautious movements, her powerful, deliberate grace. Shadow hunted the periphery of Sarah Howe Tm's acre, a silent guardian patrolling the boundary between human habitation and untamed wilderness. Sarah respected that boundary implicitly. Her photography was an act of reverence, never intrusion. She used blinds, camouflaged herself meticulously, and moved with the quiet tread she learned over years of observation. Her photographs captured the intensity and shadow Tm's gaze, the ripple of muscle beneath her spotted coat, the sheer, breathtaking wildness of her existence. As autumn bled its fiery colors onto the slopes and the air grew crisp with the promise of frost, Sarah noticed a subtle change in Shadow. The bobcat seemed leaner, her movements perhaps a fraction less fluid. The prey, rabbits, squirrels, rodents, were becoming scarcer, retreating as the mountain prepared for its winter slumber. Sarah, bundled in layers against the increasing chill during her patient vigils, felt a pang of empathy she usually reserved for creatures in obvious distress. This wasn't injury, but the quiet, relentless pressure of survival in a landscape preparing to lock down under ice and snow. The internal debate began subtly. Decades of wildlife ethics screamed against interference. Feeding wild animals could lead to habituation, dependency, loss of natural fear, dangers Sarah understood intimately. It could disrupt the delicate balance she so revered. Yet, watching Shadow Tim's diligent, often fruitless, hunts tugged at a deeper, more primal instinct, the urge to nurture, to protect. The Blue Ridge winters could be brutal, unforgiving. Was standing by, camera in hand, documenting potential starvation truly the more ethical choice? The conflict simmered within her for weeks. She researched, consulted online forums anonymously, weighed the pros and cons until her mind felt as tangled as the rhododendron thickets outside. The expert consensus was clear: do not feed the wildlife. But her heart, watching Shadow Tm's silhouette against the stark, bare trees, As dusk fell earlier each day, whispered a different counsel. Finally, driven by a compassion that overrode caution, Sarah made a decision. It would be direct feeding, not handouts that would draw the bobcat dangerously close or teach her reliance. Instead, she began leaving small, high-protein scraps, a leftover cooked, unseasoned chicken or venison from a hunter neighbor, Oke, far from the cabin, near the edge of Shadow Out Thames' known hunting route, hidden under a rocky outcrop. She did it sporadically, unpredictably, mimicking the random fortune of a successful hunt rather than a reliable food source. Xiao attempted to leave the offering after dark and retrieve any remnants before dawn, ensuring minimal direct association with her presence. She watched from a distance through her lens. The first time Shadow found the offering, there was a palpable tension in the bobcat Tia's stance. She circled it warily, nose twitching, testing the air. Then, with a swift, decisive movement, she took the food and vanished back into the undergrowth. Sarah let out a breath she had now realized she was holding. It felt like a transgression, a bending of the rules, yet the image of Shadow Audma's slightly fuller belly as she reappeared days later eased Sarah Houghton's conscience, if only partially. This silent, distant provisioning continued as the first snows dusted the peaks. Sarah never approached, never called out, never sought interaction. Her offerings were anonymous gifts left on the threshold of the wild, hoping to slightly ease the harsh calculus of winter survival. Shadow remained wary, elusive, accepting the occasional bounty without ever altering her fundamental wildness. She still hunted, still patrolled, still vanished like smoke into the trees. The boundary held, albeit softened by Sarah Houghton's cautious empathy. Sarah documented this strange secret relationship, her photographs now holding a deeper emotional weight, telling a story not just of wild survival, but of a fragile, unspoken connection across the species divide. Then came the storm. It wasn't the gentle snowfall of early winter, but a furious blizzard, a vortex of wind and blinding snow that descended upon the mountains with savage intensity. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the sturdy timbers of Sarah Houghton's cabin. Trees groaned under the weight of accumulating ice and snow, their branches cracking like gunshots in the gale. Sarah, safe beside her wood stove, felt a deep unease, her thoughts turning to the creatures exposed to the storm. As fury. She worried particularly about Shadow. Where would she find shelter? How could she possibly hunt in this whiteout? The storm raged for 2 days, imprisoning Sarah in her cabin, the world outside reduced to a maelstrom of white. When the winds finally subsided and the snow ceased, an eerie silence fell over the landscape, broken only by the drip of melting ice and the occasional muffled thud of snow sliding from branches. The world was transformed, buried under a deep, pristine blanket. Driven by anxiety, Sarah bundled up and ventured out, breaking trail through thigh-deep drifts towards the area where she often saw Shadow. The devastation was immense. Fallen branches littered the snow, some trees were entirely uprooted, their roots clawing at the air like frozen tentacles. There was no sign of the bobcat, no tracks discernible in the freshly churned snow near the offering spot, which was buried deep. A cold dread seeped into Sarah Houghton's heart. She was turning back towards the cabin, disappointment heavy in her chest, when she heard it. A faint sound, almost lost in the vast silence. Ow! A distressed mewling, weak but insistent. It seemed to come from the direction of her cabin. Puzzled and increasingly worried, Sarah quickened her pace, her snowshoes crunching a desperate rhythm. As she rounded the final bend, she stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. There, on her snow-dusted porch, huddled against the rough-hewn door, was Shadow. The bobcat looked ragged, her fur spiked with ice, her usual composure replaced by an unnerving stillness. But it was what lay nestled beneath her, partially sheltered by her body, that made Sarah Howe Tasithemus' heart clench. A tiny bobcat kitten, impossibly small and fragile, was shivering violently, its cries the source of the sound Sarah had heard. Shadow looked directly at Sarah, not with the usual wary alertness, but with something else, an unnerving directness, a gaze that seemed to pierce the veil between wild animal and human. There was no aggression, no fear, just a profound, chilling stillness that spoke volumes. The kitten mewled again, a pitiful sound, and nudged weakly against its mother. Sarah could see now that one of its hind legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, stained darker than the surrounding snow. For a long moment time seemed to freeze. Sarah stood rooted, the cold forgotten, locked in that silent, intense communication with the wild mother. Shadow did not attempt it move, did not attempt it to blink. It felt less like a confrontation and more like an appeal. A desperate, last-resort plea from one mother to another, transcending species, language, and the ingrained fear of humans. The storm had clearly taken its toll, injuring the kitten, perhaps destroying their den, leaving Shadow with an impossible choice. And somehow, guided by an instinct Sarah couldn't comprehend, she had chosen to come here, to the human she knew only as a distant observer and the source of occasional, mysterious sustenance. The trust implicit in that act struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. It was terrifying, humbling, and utterly heartbreaking. Slowly, cautiously, Sarah sank to her knees in the snow, keeping a respectful distance but making her movements slow and non-threatening. "Oh, Shadow," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, you poor things." The mother bobcat watched her, her golden eyes unwavering. The kitten cried again, a thin, reedy sound that tore at Sarah Howe's soul. She knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't turn away. The unspoken pact, the cautious boundary she had tried to maintain, had just been irrevocably breached by a mother TM's desperation and an inexplicable act of trust. The wild had come knocking, bearing its wounded heart, and Sarah knew she had to answer. Her mind raced, overriding the wave of pure emotion. This was far beyond leaving scraps under a rock. The kitten was clearly injured, possibly hypothermic. Shadow herself looked exhausted and stressed. Direct intervention was now unavoidable, but it had to be done correctly. Her first instinct was to scoop up the kitten, bring it inside to warmth, but the presence of the fiercely protective mother made that impossible and potentially dangerous, and separating them forcefully felt like a betrayal of the trust Shadow had shown. With trembling fingers, Sarah fumbled for her satellite phone inside her parka. Cell phone service was non-existent this high up. She knew she needed expert advice immediately. She dialed the number for the Regional Wildlife Rescue Center, a number she kept programmed for emergencies, though she had never imagined using it for a situation quite like this. The voice on the other end, a calm, experienced woman named Dr. Ramirez, listened patiently as Sarah poured out the story, her voice cracking with urgency and emotion. Sarah described Shadow Ostemia's presence, the kitten Tme's apparent injury, the storm, the implicit trust. Dr. Ramirez asked precise questions. Could Sarah see the extent of the injury? Was there visible bleeding? How close was the mother? What was her demeanor? "She's just watching me," Sarah explained, her gaze fixed on the bobcat. "She hasn't moved. It's like she's waiting. The kitten's let go. It looks broken, twisted." Dr. Ramirez sighed softly. "This is highly unusual behavior, Sarah. Bobcats almost never seek out human proximity, especially with young. The storm must have pushed her to the absolute limit. Okay, listen carefully. The priority is the kitten. From what you describe, it needs immediate veterinary attention. Hypothermia is also a major risk, but you cannot approach while the mother is right there. Even in this state, her maternal instincts are powerful, and she could react unpredictably if she feels threatened. The plan they formulated was fraught with risk. Sarah was to try and lure Shadow away from the kitten, just for a few crucial moments. Use food, Dr. Ramirez advised. A strong scent, something she likely recognizes from your previous assistance. Sarah How TM. Hidden feeding suddenly felt less like a transgression and more like a necessary precursor to this moment. Place it a good distance away, visible to her but far enough that you might have a window to retrieve the kitten while she investigates. Be prepared, Sarah. She might take the food and return immediately, or she might ignore it entirely. Or, Dr. Ramirez added gravely, she might become agitated. Heart-pounding, Sarah went inside, grabbed the leftover venison stew from the previous night, rich, fatty, strongly scented and carried the bowl back out. Avoiding direct eye contact with Shadow now, she moved slowly, deliberately, placing the offering about 20 feet away from the porch, partially sheltered near a snow-laden fir tree. Shadow's head turned sharply at the scent. Her ears twitched. She remained still for a tense minute, her gaze flickering between Sarah, the food, and her injured offspring. The kitten mewed again, a desperate punctuation mark in the silent standoff. Then, with a low growl rumbling deep in her chest, Shadow rose slowly. She gave Sarah one last long look before padding silently, cautiously towards the bowl of stew. This was Sarah How TM's chance. Adrenaline surged through her. Moving quickly but smoothly, she grabbed a thick towel she brought out, approached the porch, and gently, ever so gently, scooped up the tiny shivering kitten. It was terrifyingly light, its fur damp and cold. It offered only the weakest protest. Wrapping it snugly in the towel, Sarah backed away, her eyes locked on Shadow, who had reached the stew and was now eating ravenously, though her attention kept darting back towards the porch. Back inside the warmth of the cabin, Sarah cradled the tiny bundle. The kitten Autumn's eyes were barely open slits, its breathing shallow. The injured leg dangled limply. Guilt warred with relief. She had intervened, separated mother and child, but it was the only way. She relayed the situation to Dr. Ramirez, who instructed her to keep the kitten warm and secure in a box lined with soft blankets, away from drafts, until transport could be arranged. The nearest wildlife rehabilitation center, equipped to handle a Bobcat kitten, was over 2 hours away, down treacherous mountain roads. Dr. Ramirez promised to contact their team immediately. As Sarah settled the kitten, which Xiao Tiamanted instinctively started calling Leo, into a makeshift nest near the wood stove, she glanced out the window. Shadow had finished the stew and was back at the porch, pacing restlessly, sniffing the spot where Leo had been. She let out a low, guttural cry, a sound that vibrated with confusion and loss. It pierced Sarah Hautma's heart. She could only watch, helpless, whispering apologies through the glass, hoping the mother Bobcat could somehow understand the necessity of this painful separation. Shadow remained for a long time, a sentinel of grief silhouetted against the snow, before finally melting back into the woods, leaving only her tracks and an aching silence behind. The journey down the mountain was treacherous. Snowplows had cleared the main roads, but ice lingered in shaded patches, demanding slow, careful driving. Leo, nestled in a pet carrier secured on the passenger seat, was mostly quiet, occasionally letting out a soft mewl. Sarah spoke to him constantly, her voice low and soothing, trying to fill the silence left by his mother, TM's absence. She felt like a kidnapper, a betrayer of Shadow TM's desperate trust, even though she knew she was doing the only thing possible to save Liao Tem's life. The rehabilitation center was a low, functional building, buzzing with quiet efficiency. Dr. Ramirez met her at the door, her expression compassionate but professional. She whisked Leo away immediately for assessment, leaving Sarah in a small waiting area, feeling empty-handed and overwhelmed. The antiseptic smell, the distant sounds of other animal calls, the knowledge that Leo was now in the hands of strangers, it was almost too much. Hours passed in a blur of anxiety. Sarah drank stale coffee, paced the small room, and stared out at the unfamiliar landscape, so different from her mountain solitude. Finally, Dr. Ramirez returned. "Okay, Sarah," she began, sitting opposite her. "We've assessed him. We're calling him Leo, like you suggested." She smiled faintly. He's severely dehydrated and malnourished, and was definitely hypothermic. We have him on warming pads and IV fluids. The leg well, Tem's a bad break. A compound fracture of the femur. It was likely crushed, perhaps by a falling branch during the storm. Sarah's breath hitched. "Canao, can you fix it?" "Our veterinarian is excellent," Dr. Ramirez assured her. "We're going to operate tomorrow morning to set the bone and pin it. It's a complex procedure on such a small animal, and there are always risks. Infection is a major concern, but if the surgery goes well, the bone should heal." Relief washed over Sarah, so potent it made her dizzy. "He'll be okay?" Dr. Ramirez held her gaze. "He has a fighting chance, Sarah. He's young, which helps with healing, but I need to be honest with you about the prognosis for release." Sarah's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Even if the leg heals perfectly from a structural standpoint," Dr. Ramirez explained gently, "an injury like this, sustained so young, combined with the period of human care required for recovery, it significantly impacts his development. He's missing crucial time learning survival skills from his mother, hunting techniques, predator avoidance, social cues specific to bobcats. And the injury itself might leave him with a permanent slight limp or weakness, making him vulnerable in the wild. We have to consider his long-term welfare. Our goal is always release, but only if the animal has a genuine chance of surviving and thriving. With Leo, the chances are slim." The implication hung heavy in the air. A bobcat kitten raised in captivity, potentially with a physical limitation, could not be returned to the unforgiving wilderness of the Blue Ridge Mountains. "So, what happens to him?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "If he recovers well but is deemed non-releasable, we would look for a permanent placement," Dr. Ramirez said. "A licensed wildlife sanctuary, an educational facility, somewhere he can live safely and receive appropriate care for the rest of his life. These placements are hard to find, especially for predators." Sarah looked down at her hands, twisting her gloves. An idea, wild and improbable, began to form in her mind, sparked by the image of Shadow Oasis' trusting gaze on her porch. What if I could provide that placement? Dr. Ramirez looked surprised. "You, Sarah? Taking on a bobcat permanently is a massive commitment. It requires specific permits, extensive knowledge of their needs, and crucially, a secure, purpose-built enclosure that meets strict state and federal regulations. Tem's not like keeping a domestic cat." "I know," Sarah said, the idea solidifying into resolve. "I live remotely. I have land. I work from home as a photographer, specializing in wildlife. I understand animal behavior. I feel responsible. His mother brought him to me." Dr. Ramirez studied her for a long moment. "It's unconventional. We usually place animals with established facilities, but given the circumstances of how Leo came to us, perhaps Tem's worth exploring. There would be a rigorous application process, inspections, background checks. You'd need to demonstrate you can provide lifetime care and build an approved enclosure to very specific standards. It's expensive and demanding." "I understand," Sarah said firmly. "I want to try. If he can't go back to his mother, if he can't go back to the wild owl, then I want to give him a home." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. Leo TM's surgery was successful, the delicate pinning of his fractured femur deemed a technical triumph by the veterinary team. His recovery began slowly, monitored constantly by the center staff. Sarah received regular updates, photos, and short video clips. Leo tentatively putting weight on his bandaged leg, Leo lapping up special formula, Leo batting playfully at a dangling toy. Each update was a bittersweet mix of joy at his progress and sorrow for the wildlife he would never know. Back home, Sarah threw herself into the application process. It was even more daunting than Dr. Ramirez had described. Forms, essays, references, detailed plans for the enclosure, proof of financial stability, consultations with enclosure builders who specialized in zoo-grade habitats. She spent hours researching bobcat husbandry, dietary needs, enrichment requirements. Her photography work took a back seat as she dedicated herself to proving she could be a suitable guardian for Leo. Simultaneously, she began the monumental task of building the enclosure. She selected a secluded wooded section of her property, away from the main cabin but accessible for daily care. The design was ambitious, a large, securely fenced area encompassing trees, rocky outcrops, logs for climbing, and a sheltered, insulated den mimicking a natural lair. It had to be strong enough to contain a full-grown bobcat, safe for Leo, and proof against escape or intrusion by other animals. The cost was significant, eating into her savings, but Sarah did not hesitate. Every nail hammered, every roll of heavy gauge wire stretched, felt like fulfilling a promise made in the snow that desperate morning. During this time, Sarah saw Shadow occasionally. The mother bobcat haunted the edges of the property, her appearances less frequent but still poignant. She never approached the cabin again, but Sarah would sometimes spot her watching from the tree line, a silent, tawny shape against the greening landscape as spring began to thaw the mountains. Sarah felt a complex mix of guilt and reassurance during these sightings. Was Shadow searching, or did she somehow understand? Sarah could only guess, interpreting the bobcat Thames' continued presence near her territory as a form of tentative acceptance, a lingering connection to the place where her kitten had vanished, now hopefully safe. Finally, after months of anxious waiting, rigorous inspections of the nearly completed enclosure, and interviews that probed her commitment, the news came. Sarah Howe, TM's application was approved. She was officially licensed to provide permanent sanctuary for Leo. Relief washed over her, so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Leo, now almost fully healed, though still carrying a slight, almost imperceptible limp, was coming home. Bringing Leo back to the mountain felt entirely different from the frantic journey down. He was larger now, his kitten fluff replaced by the sleeker coat of a juvenile bobcat, his eyes bright with curiosity. He traveled calmly in his carrier, occasionally peering out with intelligent awareness. Releasing him into the newly finished enclosure was a moment thick with anticipation. Sarah opened the carrier door, stepped back, and watched. Leo hesitated for only a second before stepping out into his new world. He sniffed the air, his nose twitching, taking in the familiar scents of pine and earth. He explored tentatively at first, testing his healed leg on the uneven ground, investigating the logs, rocks, and native plants Sarah had painstakingly included. Then, a spark of wild instinct ignited. He made a sudden joyful leap onto a low-hanging branch, climbing with surprising agility. He explored the perimeter, rubbed against the scent-marking posts Sarah had installed, and finally discovered the cozy, den-like shelter. Sarah watched for hours, her heart full. This wasn't the wild freedom he should have had, but it was safety, security, and a space designed to stimulate his natural behaviors as much as possible. Her role shifted from distant observer and emergency rescuer to full-time caregiver. Her days now had a new rhythm, preparing Leo AOTM's specialized diet, cleaning his enclosure, providing enrichment activities, hiding food, introducing new scents, providing puzzle feeders and simply spending quiet time nearby, allowing him to grow accustomed to her presence as a constant, non-threatening part of his environment. Their bond developed slowly, cautiously. Leo, having spent critical formative weeks with humans at the rehab center, was not tame, but neither was he entirely wild in his reactions to Sarah. He regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and innate Bobcat reserve. He never sought petting or close physical contact like a domestic cat, but he learned to recognize her approach, sometimes greeting her with a soft, chuffing sound. A noise Sarah learned was a Bobcat TM's version of a contented greeting. He would often sit atop the highest rock in his enclosure, watching her as she worked outside or sat reading on her porch, a silent companion across the wire mesh barrier. One cool evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, Sarah was sitting on her porch steps, watching Leo explore his territory. Suddenly she saw movement at the edge of the woods, just beyond Leo's enclosure. It was Shadow. The mother bobcat stood partially concealed by the trees, her gaze fixed not on Sarah, but on the enclosure, on the healthy, vibrant young bobcat moving within it. Sarah froze, holding her breath. This was the closest Shadow had come since Leo's return. Leo, sensing her presence, stopped his exploration and looked towards the woods, his ears pricked forward. Mother and son stared at each other across the distance, separated by the fence and by circumstance. There was no sound, no aggression, just a long, silent acknowledgement. Shadow watched for several minutes, still as a statue, before turning and melting back into the deepening forest shadows. These visits became a regular occurrence. Shadow would appear at dusk or dawn, always keeping her distance, always focused on Leo. She never tried to approach the fence, never showed agitation. Sarah came to interpret these vigils not as longing or regret, but as a quiet confirmation. It felt inexplicably like acceptance, as if the wild mother understood that her son was safe, cared for, and that this was the only way. Perhaps she recognized him, perhaps she was drawn by scent, or perhaps it was simply the pull of territory where she had once denned. Whatever the reason, her peaceful presence nearby was a profound comfort to Sarah, a validation of the difficult choices made. Sarah often sat on her porch during these times, a silent participant in the strange, trans-species tableau. She reflected on the incredible journey from distant admiration of a wild creature to cautious intervention driven by empathy, to the shocking moment of trust on her doorstep, and finally to this life-altering commitment, Shadow TME's willingness to approach a human in her moment of deepest desperation remained a source of awe for Sarah. It challenged everything she thought she knew about the rigid boundaries between humans and wildlife. It was a testament to the power of maternal instinct, capable of overriding even the deepest-seated fear. Caring for Leo was demanding, a constant learning process, but it filled Sarah Haotemai's life with a unique purpose. He was a daily reminder of the wildness that existed just beyond her doorstep, and of the responsibility she bore. Her photography shifted focus slightly. While she still documented the wild inhabitants of the Blue Ridge, her lens often lingered on Leo, capturing his moods, his movements, the glint of untamed spirit in his eyes, even within the confines of his sanctuary. And sometimes, if she was lucky, her camera would capture the distant, watchful figure of Shadow at the forest edge. a poignant image of enduring connection and quiet acceptance. Sarah knew Leo could never truly be wild, but she dedicated herself to giving him the richest, most stimulating life possible within his sanctuary. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that the trust shown by a desperate bobcat mother had irrevocably reshaped her own life, deepening her commitment to protect the wild creatures she shared the mountains with, and proving that sometimes the most profound connections are whispered across the boundaries we believe divide us. The heart of the wild holds mysteries we may never fully grasp, but the language of compassion, once offered, can build bridges of understanding and trust in the most unexpected ways. If you enjoy this story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.